Spooky season is upon us, and while it is mired by happy haunts and lots of candy for most, it is still meant in many ways to be a terrifying time. And what could possibly be more frightening than the eternal torment of souls in the depths of hell's fire, a place from which one can never escape as they pay endlessly for the crimes committed against divine order in life? Probably spiders, or taxes, or God forbid, responsibility. But I think y'all get where I'm going with this. After all, we conveniently have 7 house wardens and 7 overblottees, and 7 is the perfect number to compare to the 7 deadly sins, given that 7 is in the name. These sins have been used in or referenced by a variety of media, usually to explore parts of the human condition. And while Twisted Wonderland does not explicitly use or reference these sins in its characters' struggles or motivations, I do think it'd be interesting to analyze these moments through this specific lens. So today we'll be exploring which of these 7 sins, in my humblest of opinions, could correlate to the actions and struggles of the 7 house wardens. Yes, house wardens, not overblottees. Why? You'll just have to stick around and see. But before we begin, I would like to clarify that this video is not a condemnation of any of the characters in any way. I am not judging or passing judgment onto anyone, nor do I intend to proclaim that Twisted Wonderland is meant to represent these concepts or any other religious themes. This is just a fun thought experiment on what the characters and their actions could be emblematic of when looked at through this lens. Along the way, we'll be talking about EN server story content, so consider this your spoiler warning. Now, I think it would benefit us to define the sins before talking about who I've associated with what, so that way we're all on the same page about what is being discussed and connected. Depending on the religious nomination or specific context, these sins' exact definitions vary, but there are commonalities between them which are often then used in pop culture contexts. For this video, my definitions will use a bit of both. However, they will trend towards the pop culture contexts as these are a little bit more applicable to this PG-13 Disney game. However, certain sins, like lust, will require additional context in order to be applied because they don't easily fit the cast with their more traditional connotations. In any case, we'll be starting our consideration today with the progenitor of all sin, pride, which is often regarded as improper faith in oneself and indulging solely in your own desires regardless of what they may be. In a religious context, this can be described as denying God's will in favor of your own. So for our consideration today, this sin will be talked about in the context of grossly prioritizing one's own will over the will of others, regardless of the consequences. Every other deadly sin applies this aspect of pride to a more specific context, like with greed being the prioritization of one's own will and desire for material wealth over the possible consequences of acquiring it. That sort of thing. This makes pride extremely difficult to pin on just one individual from NRC, as every kiddo on campus could be reasonably connected to it. After all, every single sin stems from pride, from prioritizing your will and desires above all else. And every single character at NRC does this at some point, either in the past or present. Narrowing down the suspects to just the house wardens doesn't really help either. But then I had an epiphany. Who else could be more emblematic of this sin than the one character who actively tried to reshape the world in their own image, to completely destroy the fabric of reality and reweave its remnants to suit their own needs? Who else but Edia Shroud? Plot twist, am I right? But one key difference between Edia and the rest of the house wardens, particularly Malleus, is that Edia does not care about preserving the world, at least not during his overblot. Malleus may be rewriting lives, but he desperately wants to preserve the world as it is, and in a sense is only applying his will to people, which is something we'll dive into later. But Edia doesn't care about anyone or anything other than himself and Ortho. He doesn't want to save anyone or preserve their happiness. He only cares about his own. He only cares about creating a world that he likes, that he wants, and the catastrophic consequences are not even remotely on his mind. Idia is solely focused on his own goals, thoughts, feelings, emotions, and believes himself to know better than anyone else. He is so wholly convinced during his Overblot escapade that no one can stop him, and that his new world is the solution to all of his problems, and that recreating the world is the only way forward for him. The commitment is honestly kind of amazing, actually, because I don't remember him ever giving up once during the process at all, like Leona did pre-Overblot. Idia is gunning for it the whole time, regardless of what anyone says to try to convince him otherwise, and it makes me wonder if such dedication is being fueled largely by his pride. Now, to give Idia some credit, he does try to stop Ortho when first confronted. He does deny his little brother's pleas to take over the world, but then he gets tempted by the idea that Android Ortho is actually OG Ortho, that his soul somehow got transferred over, and that what OG Ortho is saying could actually happen. There is a misplaced but understandable hope in this. However, both of the brothers go way off the deep end, with Idia bearing the brunt of the responsibility since he is the one who opened the floodgates. However, this aspect of pride, this blatant disregard for anyone outside of yourself, isn't only apparent during the Overblot crisis. In fact, in some ways, it's a very integral and consistent part of Idia's character. Throughout the story, Idia likens himself to a video game boss, putting himself in a position of power from which he can look down upon others. He's a coding prodigy after all, but even in instances where he's receiving or needing help from others, Idia seemingly can't help but boast about himself and his own accomplishments. Nowhere could this be more clearly shown than in the Phantom Bride event. In both the event and his vignette story, Idia is putting his own perspective above all else. There is no consideration for others, and in some way this can be chalked up to his middling social skills, but there is also a part of it that feels obnoxiously prideful. Everyone is doing their best to help him lest they get blasted by Ortho, but Idia isn't aware of the why, he only seems to be concerned about the how. Whenever someone messes up, he's got a quip to kick them down farther, and it really makes him seem like he thinks he's still above everything, even though Idia is the one with his life in peril. It's almost as if he's expecting a very specific style of rescue, and when he doesn't get it, he's upset because the experience isn't serving him in the way that he expected or wanted. There's no empathy or thought put towards the efforts of others, there is only concern for himself. One could argue that this is impacted greatly by the life or death part of the fiasco, so Idia could get a bit of a pass being selfish given that he is in a crisis, and I do understand that perspective. But this isn't the only time that Idia does these things. During Bean's Day, he orchestrates a deal with Sam entirely for his own benefit. When that deal falls through, he only thinks of himself and his own pain, immediately surrendering himself over despite these circumstances and despite having Vil and others present that could conceivably help him not lose to the monster team. In Vargas camp, he does the same exact thing and only thinks about himself and his comfort. In Glorious Masquerade, Bro is constantly complaining because he's having to deal with things that he doesn't want to deal with, even when his proverbial life is threatened. Even in Idia's PE uniform vignette, he's stalking Jack so that he can come up with an answer to Vargas's proposition, which satisfies Idia, that Idia likes. That has nothing to do with the moral of the situation, but is entirely built for Idia's own satisfaction. And throughout everything, there's a quip or a jab to be stabbed at someone else. There's a need to be put above them that's consistent and suits pride, in my opinion. So out of all the housewardens, I can't picture anyone else being quite as perfect for pride, although I do understand the arguments for the others given how ubiquitous this sin can be. Next up, though, we have lust, which is conventionally regarded as the sin of grossly distorted sexual desire. Since Twisted Wonderland is not at all focused on anything romantic, and is quite literally a Mickey Mouse game, there is nothing even remotely sexual about it. Therefore, for this consideration, we'll be focusing on the consent aspect of lust instead, because at its core, this sin is really about objectification, about stripping someone of their humanity and dignity to fulfill one's own selfish desires without one iota of care about the other person's consent in the matter. There is an action of taking here that is not only physical but deeply personal, which in my mind can only be connected to Malleus Draconia. As I said in the previous segment, Malleus is not quite a paragon of pride because he's not seeking to force his will onto the world as a whole, but onto its people. Malleus's overblocked struggles stem from him being unable to let Lilia go, being unable to let anyone go, and this desire to keep everyone for himself without understanding or attempting to understand their respective wills fits lust's definition much better. Malleus during this time is actively denying every person on Sage's Island their right to consent to being put to sleep by his magic, and he's extending this forced apocalypse across the world. Even when someone decides to or is prompted to wake up, Malleus comes to interfere. He claims to know what they want, claims to know how they feel, and he refuses to listen to anything that differs from his opinion. These actions are personal. They harm the individual. They silence the voice of the afflicted and transform them into objects meant to satisfy Malleus's loneliness. And even though the spell has grand influence over basically the world, the core issue with this entire situation is in the interpersonal realm. This isn't even the first time that Malleus has done this to others. In fact, it's a bit of a theme with him, one that's so important to his character that it is the focus of his dorm uniform vignette. During this vignette, Malleus is a bit upsetty spaghetti about not being invited to the housewarden meetings, even though he himself makes it nearly impossible for folks to actually reach him to invite him, including Lilia. Malleus's solution to this conundrum is not to try harder, not to establish lines of communications with other characters, something that he could do with some effort given that certain folks like Riddle aren't all that scared of him, but instead to force everyone else to meet with him in Diasomnia without communicating this intention to anyone. The other housewardens are teleported without their consent to Diasomnia when they enter the mirror chamber, the space they normally go to for these meetings. And upon learning that Malleus set this up so that he wouldn't be left out, without consulting any of them, including Crowley, who he literally could have just went up to and talked to and said, "Hey, Crowley, can we have the next meeting in Diasomnia?" And then it wouldn't have been a problem. Harsh words are understandably exchanged. Several of the characters even berate Malleus for this, going so far as to ask him if he thinks that they are just objects, for which Malleus doesn't really have a response. The same exact thing happens during Spectral Soiree, where Malleus presumably gives the ghosts the go-ahead to kidnap hundreds of students to forcibly bring them to a Halloween party they did not consent to and could not consent to because they were sleeping. All to fulfill the ghosts' wishes, since Malleus relates to them not being invited to things. Yet despite this woe, Malleus actively does not put effort into the inviting of the remaining students, but instead leaves a singular invite at Ramshackle that would have been overlooked completely if Ace had also been kidnapped. Even during the climax of this event where the information is revealed to the Hollowenders, it feels like such a scummy thing to do. A lot of this forcing of people into situations they have no knowledge of gets written off as, "They no understand human. Please forgive Faye," and I think it's bull. This may be meant instead to connect to various fairy tales where the Fae kidnap and trap humans in their realms for their own entertainment, but even in those cases, the core of what I'm connecting to still exists. The Fae of the fairy tales are trapping humans as pets, as objects, and things to look at and play with, not as actual beings with thoughts, emotions, or the ability to consent. Malleus is a little less devious, per se, but he does the same thing time and time again, not fully understanding or caring to understand why folks are upset with him, instead just chalking it up to differences of opinion. And while it's quite frustrating, it is a perfect parallel to the sin of lust. Lust doesn't care for the one being viewed, it only cares about the emotions of the viewer, and Malleus likewise is playing the role of the viewer very well, trapping everyone in little snow globes for him to watch over when he gets lonely, framing it in his head as a blessing when it's really a curse. This is not actual in any way. It is just pure objectification, making people into dolls to satisfy Malleus's loneliness, turning people into objects to serve his emotions. It's the gross dehumanization of literal humans and other fae. So in the realm of lust, I don't think that any of the other housewardens could hold a candle to Malleus. Envy seeks to take that which is not yours to take, to covet something someone else has that you may never be able to acquire, and through such thoughts, unsavory emotions are stirred. There is at times an urge to inflict pain upon the person that one is envious of, which can not only result in an outward harm for the victim, but an internal world of suffering for the envious person. To me, these themes are explored best by Vil and his story, as both he and the Evil Queen were quite envious of their respective queries, with those emotions eventually leading them to their downfalls. On the surface, Vil is rather composed, graceful, perhaps even perfect as he thinks he should be. After all, to be the fairest of all, to be the best actor of all, to be on stage for as long as possible, one has to be the best. And what could be more emblematic of that than perfection? So strong is this goal that Vil dedicates his life to refining and perfecting every aspect of himself. And yet, despite all of this effort, someone else who doesn't put in the same amount of work, presumably, usurps Vil in every endeavor. Neige LeBlanc. Not only do we get to see Vil be actively envious towards Neige during Book 5, but we also get a peek into Vil's emotional state, into his inner world, and it's there that we find a wonderful case for the effects this sin is said to have on those who harbor it. Vil wants to be the last one on stage, the one who basks in the glow of the lights until they're shut off, and yet that position currently belongs to Neige. There could even be a case made that this position was always meant for Neige, for the hero, whereas Vil, the villain, was always destined to watch from the sidelines as the plot resolves. Regardless of this, Vil wants what Neige has, and no amount of self-improvement has helped Vil get there. Over time, resentment built up that had nothing to do with Neige himself, as Vil even admits in his flashback that Neige is a pretty hard worker. But what Neige had was what Vil wanted, and the resentment towards the position ended up causing Vil to lash out at Neige, to the point where anytime Neige's name is but uttered, Vil is visually angered. To his credit, most of the time, Vil redirects this energy into the SDC practice, and I think despite this positive, there is too much resentment built within him to fully ignore the emotions. It continues to build too, as Vil obsesses in secret over Magicam metrics, about what others are saying, about if others perceive him to be in the spotlight or not, and at every turn he's confronted with Neige, being continuously reminded that what he desires most isn't his to have, and it tears him apart internally. This just continues to feed his envy, this blot, and when Vil finally has a moment of triumph, it's taken away yet again by Neige of all people. This is the breaking point, as we very clearly see in Book 5, and it results in Vil's overblot. Yet the seed for it was planted long before the SDC, in fact long before we were even in Twisted Wonderland. Through his actions, both subtle and not, Vil grew the tree of hatred himself. He actively chose to obsess over Neige, to obsess over that which was not rightfully his. And while he did the right things physically by focusing on his own beauty, he neglected to do the same internally with his emotions. Vil failed to take into account the moral of his father's advice and instead decided to hold on to these negative emotions, trying to use them as fuel towards his goal. The more that I've thought about Vil's journey, the more I began to understand this aspect of him, because it took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that it was never about Neige specifically. It was always about what Neige had. And I think coming right out of Book 4, my head was still stuck in Jamil's woes, which bled into my reading of Vil. But now it seems so obvious just how envious Vil was of someone else's possession. To get his hands on that thing, Neige had to be taken out, otherwise the spotlight would never be able to shift. Or at least that was Vil's in-the-moment reasoning for his actions. And after having nurtured this desire for so long and pinning the blame on Nej for it for so long, it was only a matter of time before an event like this occurred. And while Nej is the greatest catalyst for Vil's envy, he's not the only one. There are moments in vignettes and events where Vil's insecurity comes out. The most topical for today's discussion being Rook's labware vignette. In it, Vil gets jealous of Rook paying attention to Leona instead of to him, and Rook has to reassure Vil that while his eyes may wander, at the end of the day, they will always rest on Vil. This small interaction betrays Vil's insecurities, sure, but it's also a minor moment of envy. Vil is envious of Leona soaking up attention that Vil feels he instead deserves from someone he desires that attention from, and Vil makes it unfortunately obvious in that moment. There is at one point in time a conversation that Vil has with Idia where he openly admits that he cares way more about the opinions of others than one might think. And while this in isolation isn't directly tied to envy, when it's combined with Vil's other actions and motivations, it can take on this undertone. Vil has started to begrudgingly accept contentment with his lot in life, and it'll likely take him time to fully release his envy. However, his story is still rather emblematic of it in my mind, and therefore he's still the strongest contender, in my opinion, for this particular sin. Greed is our next sin, and as stated previously, this is an inordinate desire to possess or hoard material wealth. Quite often, this also involves some form of fraud, treachery, violence, and/or a lack of compassion, as one is typically only concerned with their own wealth and not the effect their hoarding may be having on others. Other sins like pride can be involved to some degree, as the Lorax so eloquently states in the cut song Biggering, but that song is, at its core, about greed. And no one on the Twist cast is as familiar with the concept of Biggering than Azul Ashengrotto. The greed that Azul displays derives from his pride, as all sins do, but he's never envious of others in the same way as Vil. He's not jealous that his bullies are in possession of a certain type of tailfin. He doesn't desire that which isn't his because he believes himself to be inherently worthy of it. In fact, Azul seems pretty proud of his own talents, using his octopus nature to do what his peers cannot, writing 8 times as many grimoires and studying magic at 8 times the speed. I don't think Azul truly resents being an octopus, so he has no reason to want to be a different kind of mer person or to be envious of them for their physical attributes in that sense. He has no reason to be jealous of the tailfins, but he has suffered because of others' inability to see his talents due to him being different. And this is what I think propels his greed. Azul seeks to take others' specialties so that he can inflict suffering upon them, because those who looked down on him or underestimated him are now at his mercy. This lack of compassion for others' struggles, even when they mirror his own, then enables Azul to commit fraud, treachery, and endorse violence against those who oppose him, all the while trying to absorb as much material wealth and power as he can so that he will never be able to be bullied again. He's hoarding resources for his own ego. He's taking all that he can from anyone he can to soothe his spirit, and all of this comes at a major cost. When everything he's taken suddenly disappears before his eyes, the resulting crash out is understandable, but also exactly what's deserved for the situation. The ill-begotten gains are gained for no other reason than to inflict suffering on others, whilst inflating Azul's ego. It serves no purpose other than to harm, and not only does Azul not care about the harm being done to others, he craves it. There's also lesser examples of Azul being stereotypically greedy, like in Ruggy's dream where he tells us that Ruggy can identify coins by the sounds they make when they hit the floor, a talent Azul learned about when one such occasion happened at the lounge, and a talent I'm sure Azul made use of in order to ensure not a single sore cent goes missing. This is very important because when the lounge is short some change, even an insignificant amount, Azul will not rest until the books are balanced, as we can see in the first anthology manga. There's an inherent obsession with wealth present within Azul, with material gains, and Ace even comments in Book 3 about Azul looking through his contracts as if he's counting money. A very greedy visual, no? Even in Glorious Masquerade, the thought of discovering a hidden ledger to use as blackmail against Noble Bell's student council is so exciting to Azul he cannot hold this thought in. The statement serves no purpose other than to reveal Azul's greed, because he thinks that this information will allow him to take something from Noble Bell, gaining something material in exchange for the student council's suffering, whatever that thing might be. It's abundantly clear just how much importance Azul places on material wealth and hoarding this wealth regardless of what form that takes, whether that be someone else's specialty, actual thaw marks, contracts, favors, it doesn't matter. Azul wants it all, and he doesn't lose any sleep at night over his methods. So to me, he is the poster boy of greed. Next, we have gluttony, which is all about overindulgence and overconsumption. This is most often associated with food and drink, and depending upon who you talk to, this can also include underconsumption or obsession over such things. However, since Grimm is not being included in this consideration, I'm opening up this definition to include over and underindulgence in all matter of things, except for that which is discussed by another deadly sin. For example, gluttony cannot be an overindulgence in the act of accumulating money or wealth because that is covered by greed. It likewise cannot be the overindulgence in the act of accumulating people, as that is covered by lust. Kaleem, though, I don't think cares too much about what he's accumulated, as he's had the whole world at his fingertips since before he was even a concept in his parents' mind. But he does overindulge heavily in a variety of things regardless of the cost to those around him. Feasts and parties are a huge theme with Kaleem, and I think these sorts of things generically evoke gluttony because there is so much food and so much drink that it almost begs you to overindulge lest the bounty be wasted. I don't really think that Kaleem cares about the waste aspect of his consumption or the time, energy, and manpower his parties typically require. His dorm uniform vignette shows an entire scenario where Jamil and the other dorm members are forced to work themselves to the bone in order to fulfill Kaleem's whim of providing a party so grand it'll convince the head mage to visit the Scalding Sands. The resulting spectacle is one to behold, but it's also so over the top and overindulgent for one singular individual. I do believe there is a counter-argument for generosity also existing within Kaleem because he also does not care about the cost of the items that he gives others. In fact, you could spin this parade to be an act of generosity on his behalf towards the head mage. Virtues, though, typically must be done at one's own expense, not the expense of others. So while this show is generous for Crowley and perhaps boosts Kaleem's status or ego, it came at the cost of a lot of work and support from others who couldn't say no. Jamil quite literally has never been in a position to say no to Kaleem, and even though other dorm members were helping a lot with the preparations, for something so short notice to fall onto Jamil's shoulders almost instantaneously is not fair to him, and I don't think can be counted as generosity. Sure, Jamil might be able to eat some of the food, but that doesn't justify the days of planning, prep, animal welfare checks, coordinating, etc., etc. When your generosity puts others out of commission, can that really be called generous? I don't know the exact moral answer to such a question, but the vibe that I get is a complicated no. One of the big differences I see with Kaleem compared to someone like Malleus is that Kaleem's focus is on the experience rather than the objects. Kaleem treats people like people, for the most part, and he doesn't mind sharing his wealth with them. But he also doesn't realize the kind of pressure that he's putting on his people either. He views Jamil as his best friend, not as a tool to organize parties. He views his family as a family even though some of them wish for his death. And he views other folks on campus as worthy of his time and attention. Even Edea fell victim to this at one point. Kaleem tries to smooth over bumping into Edea by inviting him to a party, of course, and insists that he come and have a good time. Edea does not want to, but eventually gets peer pressured by multiple people into attending, so the burden of consent violation does not solely rest on Kaleem's shoulders. What does fall onto Kaleem is the constant use of food and wealth to impose his will at the expense of others. If he can get folks to sit with him and eat their fill, not only will their worries melt away, but so will any conflicts. As long as Kaleem can throw enough of an experience at someone, give them enough of a reason to like him, then he doesn't have to deal with the consequences of conflict. Throughout all of these whims, though, he ends up harming those closest to him and he sets himself up for failure later, like in Playful Land, where the only idea he could come up with for conflict resolution was throwing a party with food and dancers and all sorts of over the top things. It sometimes boggles my mind just how quickly Kaleem falls back on parties as a defense mechanism. It can really be a bit jarring. I think there's also a part of Kaleem that likes to overindulge in fantasy, to ignore reality in favor of his own whims and desires. He wants to see the world as a good place with good people, so he purposefully avoids the reality that it isn't all sunshine and rainbows. He is aware, but he does retreat into this mentality quite a bit, and I think this sort of thing can also be spun as gluttony with that broader definition. Kaleem and all the other boys have their reasons for being the way that they are, of course. I can't even begin to imagine living under the constant imminent threat of death, but I don't think such things necessarily excuse all of the gluttonous habits Kaleem displays, so he's still going to be tied to it here. Wrath now is an uncontrollable, unrighteous anger that completely takes over reason and is often associated with vengeance and/or murder. However, wrath can also include anger against the innocent, anger that is unjust yet deep-seated, anger that is held for an inordinate amount of time, and even hatred for another person regardless of perceived just cause. Anger itself is not wrath, but the motivations behind the anger can transform it into wrath. And it is here that we unfortunately find Riddle Rosehearts. Riddle is hard for me to equate to wrath, but he's also the only kiddo on the cast that shows the typical signs of it. On the surface, it's very easy to see why Riddle would be compared to this sin, since the boy is very angry very often, even sometimes over seemingly innocent things like a chestnut tart. He screams, he shouts, he lets it all out, and his temper is triggered easily. From an outside perspective, it can appear as though Riddle doesn't have any rational thoughts, since most of his outbursts come after minute things. However, internally, all of this anger and rage is meant to show care, and because of this, Riddle feels entirely justified in his actions, assuming his rage to be righteous, and while I know it isn't, it's kinda hard to blame the guy. His entire life was spent equating this sort of rage to love, so it's only natural for him to be this way despite the inherent flaws of this philosophy. The fact is that Riddle is not righteous in his anger, it does not accurately communicate care, it's deep-seated due to Riddle's darn mother, and it's almost always at the expense of the innocent. In Book 1, this is very clearly displayed with the entirety of the story focusing around Ace's tart mishap. The poor boy was at the school for like a day and accidentally broke a rule he was ignorant of. Instead of turning this into a constructive learning experience, Riddle decides to strictly enforce the rules with no mercy, with a wrathful anger at someone who didn't deserve that level of intensity. It's not just Ace either. The entire dorm is punished in this way for even the slightest of infractions. The Queen of Hearts rules do keep order in the dorm, but they aren't the most sensical things. And given how many rules there are, it's almost impossible for those who don't have a photographic memory or intense study habits to memorize them all immediately. Yet Riddle doesn't care about the whys, he only cares about the actions. And he plays this off as love for his students due to his own issues, while also rejecting any criticisms of his actions. I think perhaps if Riddle was in place of Sebek in the Thrills and Chills event, he might have been able to give Scully better advice, because their predicaments aren't all that dissimilar. It's difficult to see the flaws in your own convictions, especially when they've kept you safe. But just because you believed something to be true your whole life doesn't mean it actually is. And in Riddle's case, challenging this isn't met with actual thoughts and considerations, but with rage. He cannot be challenged due to his own insecurities. He cannot face the possibility that he could be wrong, and this results in his unjustified, unrighteous, and frankly vengeful anger. I feel like there is a little bit of Riddle being angry at his own helplessness when he lashes out at folks in Book 1, because he really wanted to eat that chestnut tart. He really wanted to let it go, but he felt so trapped by his own convictions that part of his anger at himself ended up fueling his lashing out at others, I think anyways. This whole mentality is tortuous not just for his dormmates, but for Riddle too, and that's the natural consequence of wrath. By directing this anger at others, By completely disregarding anyone else's reasoning but your own and causing harm or seeking vengeance against those who only you perceive to be a threat, you not only destroy them, but yourself in the process. It's an all-consuming, relentless fire, one that riddles actions and motives, at least early on in the story, fits all too well. So as much as my heart bleeds for him and his situation, I cannot excuse his actions, and for them, he's being tied to wrath here. Last but not least is Sloth, which is a bit unique because it can involve any or all states of laziness. This includes not only the physical realm, but the emotional and spiritual ones too. This scope is wide and deep, allowing Sloth to pertain to any number of lazy actions. But I think for this consideration, it would be best for us to narrow it down at least a little bit to avoidance of responsibility and lack of care for duty. Originally, this sin was meant to represent these two things in a spiritual context, a lack of due reverence for religious duties such as prayer, or an indifference towards it. So I think it's apt to apply this sort of context for the sin of sloth to Leona Kingscholar. This lion can be seen slacking off frequently throughout the game series, opting to nap instead of attend classes, sleep in if he can help it, and slip away from sports practices to get some shut-eye. These actions can be seen as lazy in the physical sense, however Leona is also a lion, and lions are known to be sleepy creatures, which means he could get a pass in this regard since catnaps are literally a biological need of his. But more often than not, these trips to the botanical garden seem like more than just a biological necessity. They seem to be an act of avoidance. Leona pursues these activities so that he cannot be found by the staff or his dorm mates, so he doesn't have to do his duties as housewarden or as a student, so he can escape his reality for a brief moment. His purpose at the school is technically to be a student, which comes with certain responsibilities, and he knows that having the title of housewarden also comes with certain responsibilities, yet he just can't seem to be bothered to care about these things or the work they entail unless they end up inconveniencing him more. In Book 2, we see a haphazard attempt at caring for his dorm mates in Leona's plot to take down Malleus, but he gives up immediately once he's caught, giving in to that which he believes is inevitable. Even the plan itself was half-baked because Malleus could just float over the stampede, like he does in the manga, to redirect folks back to the stands post-stampede. There is a lack of effort in not only this plan, but its execution, with Leona never really taking an active role in the plot. He sits back, he gives orders, he does get himself in with Azul for that potion, a potion that Leona likely bought with money or something that mattered little to him. The plot is touted as being extremely important, but Leona doesn't seem like he can be bothered to care. He's apathetic to his own potential success, and this is likely due to his complicated emotions. But it could just be that he gave up long before the initiative began. Sure, he talks quite a bit about taking down Malleus in the housewarden meeting, but does he truly believe that it's possible? Or is he placating his ego, only to later realize he now has to actually do something, and that plot ends up half-baked because of Leona's laziness? Regardless of what the truth actually is, Leona comes across as not having an inkling of duty or responsibility in these actions, even going so far as to say he only did them on his dorm mate's behalf and not to satisfy his own ego, shifting the blame to avoid taking responsibility for the fallout. In various vignettes, Leona provides help when it's absolutely necessary for him to maintain his baseline. He doesn't jump in to help Jack immediately in his dorm vignette, nor does he care too much about dirty tricks of his dorm members. It's only when Jack is immediately threatened by his upperclassmen that Leona steps in. And this action isn't one of benevolence, it's the bare minimum Leona needs to maintain his power while ensuring the Spelldrive team doesn't lose its main players. Leona isn't compelled by a sense of duty or feelings of responsibility for his fellows, but instead practicality, and it shows in his lack of care for the upperclassmen that faint from witnessing Leona's special magic. Ruggy has to come in and stop Leona from going too far because Leona doesn't even notice that the horde of kiddos he's up against have already fallen. He's too lost in his own sauce, and therefore ends up neglecting his duty. We can even see aspects of this lazy attitude in Leona's dream, where he just simply cannot care enough to take responsibility for his own actions that led the country to its ruin. He has other folks do his dirty work for him, and even then he doesn't take the time to ensure they're carrying out his orders properly. Even if Leona cares on an emotional level, all of his actions present apathy on the physical. He even has the audacity to demand meat when there is no food in the country. A very obvious tie to the Lion King, but even still, I think it shows a tone-deaf disregard for his duty as a regent. This aspect of Sloth is present in nearly all of Leona's actions, regardless of his emotional state, and I do think there is a lot of nuance here, just like there was with Riddle and pretty much all of the other boys. But for the sake of this consideration, I think the evidence pretty solidly points to Leona for being the best suited to Sloth. However, with that, we've got our final deadly 7 and the sins I'd associate with each of them. Again, this wasn't meant to condemn them, but to explore how each character's themes might fit with these concepts, and I imagine you probably have some differing opinions. Regardless of whether you agree or disagree with my takes, please let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section. If comments aren't your thing, you could always like and subscribe instead. But before you go, I just have to remind you that you're amazing, and I hope you have a wonderful day.